I saw a gender activist recently arguing on Twitter. I'm not sure who she was, but she had a doctorate. I believe it was in some type of sociology of gender. And she was talking about how the term sex is a social construct is perfectly valid, she said. And she was talking about how the meanings that we prescribe onto people's bodies is a social construct. She said that, and that is what sex is. We're prescribing meaning onto people's bodies, onto people's body parts. So why do we call a boy a boy? Why do we say that a boy will become a man? And so she's coming at it from completely sociological
Hmm.
perspectives. But then, ironically, what she's also saying, she's really talking about gender in a way, prescribing meanings or social roles or expectations to people's bodies. Maybe I think what she's really getting at is gender. But there's this forwarding that they did in queer theory in the 90s, where they really took it a step further than the second wave feminists, where really now they're saying that, yeah, sex is a social construct too.
Hmm.
And it's a more of a political and a social decision, as a lawyer from the ACLU said. And so I do think that gender and sex, they can't be completely separated because there's
Uh-huh.
still a link there, especially when it comes to behavior and personality and interests, but it doesn't mean that gender is completely biological or completely sociological.
Hmm.
Uh, Heather Heying has said before that gender is the behavioral expression of sex. And so that's defined by biology and culture. It's that intermingling of those
Mm.
two that define gender. And I think gender is really uh, about, like, when we talk about behavior, it's really about averages. So like
Hmm.
on average, men tend to have these interests or personality factors, and women on average tend to have this, but then there's a lot of overlap between the two.
Right.
And so we could say that, masculine would be a trait that is more common in males, but that women can also have. And then
Right.
feminine is a trait common in females that males can also exhibit.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, gender is definitely much more uh, malleable and can change over time, but then you have sex, which is really set in stone at conception and through in utero development. Uh, but you still have that linkage there between
Yeah.
sex and gender, which is important. Yeah.
It's kind of it's like a Venn diagram where there's sort of that
Yeah.
overlap, even though they're
Yeah.
sort of different concepts. And what's interesting too, if you read old papers in biology, they didn't make that distinction at all. And actually, still to this day, when they talk about like the gender of chimpanzees or something, they're talking about their sex. So this was sort of a feminist construct, which I think is fine. I mean, it is sort of
Hmm.
teasing apart that biopsychosocial components of things,
Yeah. I think
but
the
then it's
important thing
like,
about that
yeah.
analysis is that with gender and the feminist perspective, it is important uh, to really tear apart regressive expectations and
Hmm.
regressive roles for the sexes. And that's a good goal to have. Uh, you can go too far when you put too much emphasis on the sociological component,
Yeah.
where you start denying mainstream science. And
Right.
when it comes to sex, when
Right.
it comes to just average sex differences that have been replicated,
Yeah.
just basic things. So, yeah, I think it's that balance between the sociological and the biological. But gender, definitely, there is an important component of defining it as the as expectations or regressive roles. But then you also have more of the just personality and interests and that kind of things
Yeah.
that are not
Yeah.
regressive.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's that overlap with personality research. And the personality model has the most validation is that big five
Big five.
personality
Hmm.
inventory. And again, on average, women have display certain um, traits on average more than men do. It doesn't mean that. So like agreeableness is one, right? And women tend to
Hmm.
be on average more agreeable than men, on average less emotionally stable than men. And so
Hmm.
on the aggregate, actually Scott, I'm not sure you know the psychologist Scott Barry Kaufman. He has a great article,
I
blog
don't think so.
post. Oh, okay. He had a great article, actually written on Scientific American, which I don't think he'd probably get published these days, but that looked at, well, these personality differences individually aren't that big, but when you take them all together, they have this sort of additive effect that being more
Right.
agreeable, being more less sort of emotionally stable, um, these things kind of compound each other, and so we end up with
That's
these big behavioral
right.
differences. So
That's the really cool thing about multivariate analysis. And when it comes to personality psychology like that,
mm-hmm.
you can have these really close averages that like overlap a lot. But then, like let's say, agreeableness. Well, agreeableness, the overlap there is really large. And
Right.
it's about, I think, 60-40, that kind of thing. And but on the extreme ends, where you get to the tail ends of the graph, that's where the largest differences really show themselves, is on that,
Yeah.
extreme agreeable or extreme disagreeable. And so you can simultaneously say that men and women share more commonalities and overlap there on the average, but
Mm-hmm.
then also that they're not at all alike on the extremes. And so you can have like that's why the most disagreeable people in the world are almost all men, and the most agreeable people in the world are almost all women. But then
Right.
you have that average that really overlaps.
Yeah.
So that's the really cool thing that I discovered when I was writing about personality psychology was
Yeah.
that overlap there and how that you can have your cake and eat it too. You know?
Well,
Yeah.
and that's what got James Damore into trouble. And I feel like what happens in those debates is that there are people that I don't know if they're just ignorant of statistics, or they're sort of arguing in bad faith and they want to smear somebody, but they take that to mean that, well, you're talking about all women or you're talking about all men, or you're prescribing something, when in fact you're just saying this is an observation based on good data, and we're not saying that you have to fit in the middle of the bell curve. You could be an outlier, and that's totally fine, but it
Right.
is okay to say that something is atypical, that it's not
Just on a statistical level.
on a
Yeah, it's
statistical level,
yeah.
like, and that's
It's
cool.
yeah.
Like, I totally support that. I love the diversity of
That's
people.
that's the cool thing about stuff
Yeah.
like this. Like when you really understand the statistics, you can really see that variation.
Yeah.
And it actually, I think, understanding those statistical differences and the variation between men and women and within men and women really shows you the diversity, and it also reduces the power that stereotypes have on people. Because when you understand that, an average doesn't mean that all people are like this,
No.
you can really see that full variation. And I think it gives us power to really deconstruct in the good sense, like stereotypes, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Well, and I can see the flip side of it too. I can see that people don't like that type of research, because there are people that will take that research and use it to, justify saying, or use it in a way that suggests that all, like, you should be that way, or why are you so weird, or this is, you're
Right. Yeah.
abnormal. And
Right.
it's
They're
like,
prescribing a moral
yes,
framework
yeah,
onto the
yeah,
person instead of just accepting in a non-judgmental way
yeah.
what their atypical behavior is. They'll be like, yeah, this is the average and this is how it should be.
Yeah,
It's
and you're
yeah, it's
strange,
totally
and
wrong.
fall in
Yeah.
line, and I don't think, at least that's not my. I think you have to separate what is from what ought to be, and people seem to have a trouble with that. They feel really, um, they feel fearful about people talking about what is, because then they're worried it's going to be taken as being prescriptive.
That's what I've noticed all the time when I'm talking about why there's only male and female sexes,
Yeah.
and why we only have two, and how that occurred and how it works in development. People will sometimes get the idea that I'm prescribing some moral view of the world of how it ought to be,
Yeah.
but not what actually is. But that's not. It's totally reverse of what's actually going on.
Yeah.
What is that there's two sexes, but then there's a range of expression and identity that people can have, and there's no. I'm not prescribing a moral framework at all. People should be able to live the life they choose as long as it doesn't infringe
Yeah.
on other people's rights. But it's important to recognize what is, especially when it comes to things like sex.